And as we allow our awareness to shift into the heart, receive into your heart these words from the Gospel of Thomas, and then we'll begin a chant based on them, which you're welcome to join your voices to as you're comfortable. From the Gospel of Thomas. Jesus said, "I am the light shining upon all things. I am the sum of everything, for everything has come forth from me, and toward me all things unfold. Split a piece of wood, I am there. Lift a stone, and you will find me there." I am the light, I am the light, shining upon all things. I am the light, I am the light, shining upon all things. I am the light, I am the light, shining upon all things. I am the light, I am the light, shining upon all things. Jesus said, "I am the light shining upon all things. I am the sum of everything, for everything has come forth from me, and toward me all things unfold. Split a piece of wood, I am there. Lift a stone, and you will find me there." So again, welcome back, and thank you for all your engagement yesterday, especially as we moved into the heart. I feel like in some ways that session we did on working with the heart, or what we'll find in these texts is sometimes called the bridal chamber. It's the place of unity, the place of union, and it's not far off. It's right here in the center of our being. We can enter into this place of oneness with the beloved in our heart, in the bridal chamber of the heart. And I want to hear your reflections on your experience with that, but we'll hold off to the end. But I would love to hear what it was like for you as you continued working with the heart space yesterday into the evening, if you worked with it in morning practice at all today, what's stirring for you and awakening in that. So hold on to what's alive for you from that. And this morning we're going to begin our deep dive into the Gospel of Thomas itself, which is a text that's really in many ways revolutionized my own experience of Jesus and of contemplative Christianity. And I've really come to believe that it is a core text for contemplative Christian discipleship in the 21st century, which is a bold claim to make for a non-canonical text. But this text, it really began coming alive for me about 6 years ago now, when with my parish, my little Woodstock parish church, we started a study on the sayings of Jesus from this gospel. And it all happened kind of by accident. I had been interested in the Gospel of Thomas for years. Cynthia Bourgeault has used this text in her own teachings, but I always felt, it's a little too fringy to use as an entry point into Christian contemplation or contemplative tradition. It's better to use, obviously Orthodox mystics. Let's use John of the Cross and Julian of Norwich and, maybe even Meister Eckhart, but I don't know about this Gospel of Thomas thing. But it had kind of been in the back of my mind. And when I moved to Woodstock and started at the parish, the local paper interviewed me, and I said offhandedly to the reporter, we were just kind of casually talking, and I said, I've been thinking about doing this Gospel of Thomas study, but I'm not sure. And then I went on and told her that we had a 5:30 evening prayer service at St. Gregory's. Well, the paper came out that week, and it said there's a 5:30 Gospel of Thomas study at St. Gregory's. And so I showed up that week and I said, well, folks, it's printed in the paper, so here we go. And it was just the little push I needed to engage a text like this. And so I took it as just a little Holy Spirit, wink, and we dove in. And as we worked with the text, we took one saying a week and engaged it in a sort of Lectio Divina contemplative reading process with meditation around it and a contemplative Eucharist shared. And folks found it really transforming their relationship with Jesus, because these were words that were recognizably Jesus. It felt like Jesus, but they also weren't dulled by 2,000 years of repetition. They were fresh words, and lifted outside of any narrative context, it was like he was speaking directly to us in the moment. Like, here is Jesus speaking a living word. And people just found their intimacy with the living Jesus deepening, and people started tiptoeing into the parish. They would, hear, well, there's this weird Gospel of Thomas thing going on, and people who would never have come in the door on a Sunday morning, much too formal, they came in to this Thursday night class, and I never used it as an attempt to get people to Sunday, but I found that little by little, there were people who came for 2 years to this study before they ever decided to show up on a Sunday. And then little by little, they started tiptoeing into Sunday. And they brought the grounded presence of that contemplative service into the Sunday worship. And there was just a wonderful sort of infusion back and forth. And I found that it offered a doorway into the church for people that set a sort of low bar, sounds offensive, but a sort of intriguing bar, for people to toe in and see what this was about and meet Jesus in a new way. So I've slowly become convinced that it's a really wonderful doorway for people that doesn't need to be in competition with our canonical texts, but can actually deepen our appreciation of those canonical gospels, give us a fresh lens to read that material through. So I find it to be a really helpful and compelling supplement to the canon, just in the way we would encourage one another to read the sayings of the desert mothers and fathers, and to not see that those are in competition with the canonical texts. So we'll be engaging it that way. What does it offer to the tradition without being in competition with the tradition? And I want to start diving into Thomas with a new vocabulary word. For some of you, this will be a familiar word, but it's the word Christophany. I'll write it here for you to see. So Christophany, it's like Epiphany. Let's see if we can make that a little, there you go. Like the word epiphany or the word theophany. So it means a disclosure or a manifestation of Christ. So theophany is a disclosure of theos, of God. Epiphany is a flash of light and insight. And so this was a word coined by the Roman Catholic priest Ramon Anacar. And if you don't know him, he's at some point worth some of your time and attention. He wrote a book titled Christophany. So to give you a background on him, he was born in 1918 to a Spanish Roman Catholic mother and an Indian Hindu father. So he had interreligious experience sort of in his DNA. And he very early entered into studies for the priesthood and became a Roman Catholic priest. But he found that he was compelled to really go and explore the other half of his soul, to explore the Hindu side of his family lineage. And so he went to live in India. And years later, he would joke when he had come back to Europe. He said, "I left Europe a Christian. In India, I discovered myself a Hindu, and I returned home a Buddhist without ever having ceased to be a Christian." So that gives you some sense of his really expansive spirit and his really universal experience of Christ. So Panikkar said that a non-reductive Christian vision, I'm trying to quote him from memory, that a non-reductive Christian vision should be able to assert that every being is a Christophany, is a disclosure of what he called the Christic adventure of the universe. That Christ reality, that union of the human and the divine, is at the heart of all of us. And he used this word Christophany in relationship to, and in some ways in tension with, the more familiar seminary word Christology. And if you know that word Christology, it simply means our theology about Christ, our beliefs, our ideas, our concepts about Jesus and who he was. And Panikkar said that's well and good, but it's still ultimately a head trip, our concepts about Jesus. He said Christophany is about entering the mystical experience of Jesus. How do we enter into the consciousness of Christ and experience that unity, that oneness, that love for ourselves? He said that's really what Christophany is about. And so Christology is a good starting point, but it should lead us into Christophany. And the Gospel of Thomas is really a text that's about this. It's about entering into the heart and the mind of Christ. So, for example, in saying 108 of the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says, "Whoever drinks what flows from my mouth will become like me. I myself shall become that person, and the hidden things will be revealed to them." So he's inviting us to drink from the wisdom that flows from his mouth, to become intoxicated from that drink, and to become him even as he becomes us. And so in this, he's talking about not being transformed into a Christian, but being transformed into Christ. How are we, each of us, to be transformed into Christ? And for Panikkar, this doesn't cancel out our traditional Christology, but it says, how do we look for the mystery that's been defined in the great creeds and councils of the church that I poked a bit of fun at yesterday? How do we find that same mystery in ourselves? And so he said that Jesus is the symbol or the sacrament of the whole of reality. So the mystery defined in, say, the Council of Chalcedon, that Jesus is the full and perfect union of the human and the divine. Panikkar says, yes, that's true. And Jesus is the symbol or sacrament of what's true everywhere and in all things. And so he invites us to find that mystery of the full union of spirit and matter, of the creaturely and the divine, at the heart of ourselves and at the heart of the universe. Incarnation is what God is doing everywhere. And so this is an invitation from Panikkar, but also in the Gospel of Thomas, to expand our sense of what the incarnation of God is all about. And I want to give us, for a jumping off point, a quotation that comes from Barbara Brown Taylor, who I started also with a quotation from yesterday. And she says of the incarnation, "When I was taught the concept of incarnation, of God made flesh, I was taught to capitalize it, capital I, incarnation. The incarnation happened just once in one person a very long time ago. And Jesus alone was God's word made flesh. As his follower, my job was to trust that that was true and persuade others to think it was true as well. The incarnation was presented to me as an article of faith. It was a unique event that involved Jesus and no one else, and the fate of my own flesh depended on the acceptance of that fact." Relatively late in life, I have decided that incarnation is less a doctrine than a practice, which Jesus did not come to do once and for all, but to show any who were willing how God's word might become flesh in their lives too. So what she's doing here, she's breaking open our idea of what the incarnation of God is all about. The incarnation doesn't simply begin and end in Jesus. It's not an alien God breaking into the world in Jesus for 33 years and then taking off back up into heaven. It's something that continues unfolding through all of us and through all creation, not a doctrine, but a practice. And while she presents this, Barbara Brown Taylor, as a new insight for herself, it's actually an ancient insight within the Christian tradition. Meister Eckhart put it like this back in the 14th century. We are all meant to be mothers of God, for God is always needing to be born. What good is it to me if Mary is full of grace, if I am not also full of grace? What good is it to me for the Creator to give birth to the eternal Son, if I also do not give birth to him in my time and my place? This then is the fullness of time, when the Son of God is begotten in us. St. Athanasius summed up this insight similarly in his words that in Jesus, God became human in order that humanity might become God. This is something that's to continue unfolding through each and every one of us. God is to continue taking flesh in all creation. And so I bring up this language of Christophany and incarnation as a jumping off point for Thomas, because it's within this theological vision that this text really makes sense. And it's a text that I think we could call a Christophanic gospel rather than a Christological gospel. It's not about what you're to believe about Jesus or what the right concepts and labels are for Jesus, but how you're to enter that Christic experience. And this is captured beautifully in a saying that shows up both in the canonical Gospels and in Thomas in slightly two different ways. And so this, many of you will remember this. It's the scene where Jesus says to the disciples, shortly before he enters Jerusalem, "Who do you say that I am?" He asks them, "What are people saying? Who do they say that I am?" They say, "Oh, well, some say that you're a prophet. Some say that you're John the Baptist returned." And he says, "But who do you say that I am?" And Simon Peter chimes in and says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And we usually want to pat Peter on the back for getting it right. But if we stay with the text, we find that just a few moments later, Jesus says, "Okay, you think that I'm the Christ? Well, let me tell you what this means. I'm going to be betrayed. I'm going to suffer. I'm going to die." And Peter says, "God forbid it, Lord." So we see that Peter seemingly has the right label, but the wrong understanding. He doesn't really understand what Jesus' path of self-emptying love is about. He still wants it to be about political and worldly power. So Thomas responds with a Christological answer, a label for who Jesus is. The same story shows up in the Gospel of Thomas, and it unfolds in this way. This is saying 13 in the Gospel. Jesus said to his disciples, "Compare me. Tell me who I am like." Simon Peter said to him, "You are like a righteous angel." Matthew said to him, "You are like a wise philosopher." Thomas said to him, "Master, my mouth is wholly incapable of saying what you are like." Jesus said, "I am not your master, for you have drunk and have become intoxicated from the same bubbling spring which I have measured forth." Thomas doesn't respond with a Christological label. He falls silent before the mystery of who Jesus is And in his silence, he is one with that mystery. He's taken beyond and deeper than any of the words or labels. And Jesus says, I'm no longer your master. You've drunk from the bubbling spring of my being, and you have become intoxicated. You have entered the mind of Christ. So a Christophanic gospel rather than a Christological gospel. And it's also sometimes called by scholars a sophiological gospel. And we'll look at that more later. But Sophia is the Greek word for wisdom, for holy wisdom. And so it's called a sophiological or a wisdom gospel. And interestingly, scholars for a long time had wondered the titles, the Christological titles given to Jesus in the canonical Gospels, like the Son of Man, like the Christ, the Messiah, were these titles that Jesus used for himself in his own lifetime and in his own teaching, or were they titles given to him by the early community that were then retrojected back into the early texts? And that's what many scholars have believed, that Jesus probably didn't go along calling himself the Christ and the Messiah, etc., but that these titles are given to him. And the Gospel of Thomas, if it is an early text, which we'll look at how we should date this text as we move along, if it is early, it does seem to point to a layer in the tradition before these titles were applied. None of the Christological titles are yet applied to Jesus. At this point, he's just the living Jesus who is teaching this living wisdom. So I want to dive into now a little bit of the context and the history of this text, how we should date this text, how this text was discovered. And I want to spend a good bit of time on these questions this morning because this text has so been sort of vilified. It's called a heretical text. It's a late heretical Gnostic text. Many of us have heard, and a lot of early scholarship has said. And so there's a real wall to approaching it and integrating it into the life of the church in any kind of way. And so we're going to just spend a little time digging into the history around it. So what is this text? Where did it come from? We had known for several centuries that an early text called the Gospel of Thomas once existed. It is referenced in the writings of some of the church fathers, but we had no extant manuscript copies of it whatsoever. So we knew that it was once around, didn't exist any longer. Until in the 40s, an Egyptian farmer was digging for fertilizer in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, and northern Africa. And as he was digging, he hit upon a large clay pot, this clay urn or vessel. And at first he was afraid to break it open because it might have a jinn in it, an evil spirit or a genie in it. And then he thought, but it might have treasure in it. So he smashed it open and out tumbled not gold, but this cache of early Christian manuscripts, early Christian writings that we had never seen before. And he didn't really know the value of what he had found. The legend goes that he brought it home and his mother burned some of the manuscripts to start the fire for cooking dinner that night. But eventually they made their way onto the black market and eventually made their way into the hands of scholars and were translated. One of the most significant finds in this collection was what we now call the Gospel of Thomas. And it's significant because it seems to be one of the earliest texts that was found in this collection. And it wasn't only Christian manuscripts. There was a copy of Plato's Republic in this collection, a wide range of early texts. And it's thought that probably in the 4th century, under tightening standards of orthodoxy, that Constantine issued an edict that scriptures that were no longer declared canonical or authoritative should be destroyed. And that these specific scriptures were held by a Pachomian monastery. St. Pachomius is one of the early monastic founders. And these were found very close to the ruins of a Pachomian monastery. So it's thought that some of these monks, rather than burn or destroy these texts, which made them heartsick, they said, let's just go bury them in the desert with the hopes that at a later, kinder, gentler time, they could be retrieved. And so they remained buried for 2,000 years nearly. or 15, 1600 years. And when we discovered Thomas, the version that was found at Nag Hammadi, it's a Coptic translation of an originally Greek text. And it's a nearly perfect, complete Coptic version. There are a few little holes in the text, but it's the full manuscript. And we recognized that we had actually discovered the Gospel of Thomas once before in 1897. There was an archaeological dig in the old Roman city of Oxyrhynchus, which is south of Cairo, and fragments of a manuscript were found, just very small fragments of sayings of Jesus. And scholars were never able to identify what text these fragments of sayings came from until the Coptic version was discovered, and they lined up. So all contemporary research on Thomas, it goes back to the Coptic translation and the early Greek fragments. Those are our two sources. And what the text turned out to be, it's a sayings gospel. It's not a narrative gospel that tells the story of Jesus. It's just a collection of 114 sayings. Each one begins, Yeshua said, or Jesus said. And it opens with the words, these are the hidden sayings that the living Jesus spoke and that Judas Didymus Thomas, or Judas Thomas the twin, recorded. And hidden there, it could mean secret sayings, or it can just mean inner teachings, the inner sayings of Jesus. And so this doesn't ever claim to be a complete gospel. It just claims to be a collection of some of the inner teachings of Jesus. And this sayings gospel genre was something that scholars had hypothetically proposed, that in the early years of the church, Christians simply recorded sayings of Jesus in the time of the first apostles, and that eventually these sayings collections got incorporated into narrative gospels. And we had proposed that a sayings collection named Q once existed, from the German word Quelle for source. It just means source. And the thinking was that Q is embedded in Matthew and in Luke. So if you've ever done a close reading of Matthew and Luke, you realize that almost the entirety of the Gospel of Mark is embedded in Matthew and Luke. So when they wrote their Gospels, they had Mark in front of them, and they essentially expanded and redacted Mark. And if you take Matthew and Luke and you yank all of the obviously Markan material out, there is two remaining sections of material. There's some material that's unique, that's only in Matthew and only in Luke, but there's this other collection of material that overlaps, that's in both Matthew and Luke, pretty much identically, but not in Mark. And so the proposition was that overlapping material was called Q, this common source that Matthew and Luke shared. And they wove Q in with Mark and their own special material to create their Gospels. So Q was a hypothetical sayings gospel that now exists embedded in those texts. And scholars proposed this was likely the form early Gospels took. So that was confirmed for the first time when Thomas was discovered. We went, aha, there were sayings gospels, just like the scholars had theorized. So the first question was, is Thomas Q? Have we discovered the original Q source? But it wasn't. It's a different collection. It's a different order, different sayings, but it's the same kind of document that Q would have been. So what Thomas is, it's a collection of material that almost half of it overlaps with what we find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke in the synoptic gospels. And there's a canonical equivalent of about half of the sayings. Sometimes they're tweaked in a little different direction, but they're pretty familiar, pretty close. But then the other half of these sayings were totally new or unfamiliar sayings, sayings of Jesus that we had never encountered before. And what's really important is that when these sayings were examined from a literary critical perspective, and Stephen Patterson is the scholar who's done the most detailed work on this. Stephen Patterson in his, I'll show you the book later and put it in a bibliography, but he's really closely, critically examined the sayings, and he says that Thomas does not seem to be dependent on the canonical Gospels. So what that means is the author of Thomas didn't sit down with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and pick out all of his favorite sayings and make a new thing called the Gospel of Thomas. The phrasing and the arrangement of the material is just different enough that it doesn't seem to have been copied from those familiar texts. So what that means is that Thomas represents an independent stream of the early Jesus tradition. It means that Thomas, or the Thomas compiler, like the other gospel authors, drew on early layers of oral tradition to create this collection. So it's a collection from the headwaters of the tradition. And so it gives us another independent source for studying the sayings of Jesus. But this is what's most interesting for me, is that when we then begin comparing the shared material that's in Thomas and the canonical Gospels, is that there's a group of material that overlaps, but it's tweaked in just slightly different direction. And we'll start looking at the difference. The other important thing is that when we compare the five Gospels, a baseline of shared material emerges. And that's what we looked at yesterday as wisdom teaching. Parables, aphorisms, proverbs, koan-like sayings. And these wisdom teachings are shared across all of the Gospels. And so with Thomas independently attesting to this kind of material, it really tells us that this was Jesus' primary mode of teaching. And then all of the other material in Thomas, it's also wisdom material, but sometimes it's even more explicitly wisdom material, more explicitly leaning in a mystical, non-dual direction. Now, for the material that is shared but interpreted differently, this is material that in our canonical Gospels, it takes on an apocalyptic or an end times kind of flavor. It's about the end of the world and the coming judgment. Those sayings in Thomas, we find they exist in Thomas, but they're interpreted in a totally non-apocalyptic way. They're just solely a wisdom saying. So to give you an example of what I mean by this, you may remember a saying that's told in Matthew's gospel. So this is the story of a fisherman who went out to fish and cast his nets. So Jesus says the kingdom of God is like this. Fisherman went out to fish. He cast his nets and he pulled them in, and there were several good fish and several bad fish. And he cast back the bad fish and he kept the good fish. And the disciples want to know what this means, and Jesus says, it means at the end of time, the Son of Man will come with his angels, and he will separate the good from the wicked, and the wicked he will burn with unquenchable fire. So the saying is all about the end times, the apocalypse, the coming judgment. So this saying also exists in the Gospel of Thomas, but this is how it goes in that version. The kingdom of God is like this. Man went out to fish, he cast his nets, he pulled them in, and there were several small fish, but there was one big, fine fish. And without hesitation, he threw back the small fish and kept the one fine fish. End of parable. So what's gone in this version, first of all, the sort of moralizing. It isn't good fish and bad fish any longer. It's just the small fish and the one big fish that's really worth your life, so to speak. The apocalyptic is gone. It's no longer about a final separation, a fire, or a judgment. And the amazing thing that happens is this moves this parable into perfect alignment with the other two parables Matthew groups this teaching with. So Matthew has this in a cluster, and the other two parables are the parable of the pearl of great price. A merchant discovered a pearl of great price, and he sold everything else so that he could possess the pearl. And then he tells the story of a man who found a treasure hidden in a field, and he sold everything to buy that field and possess that treasure. And then the parable of the man who pulled in his nets, saw all the small fish, threw them back, and kept the one big, fine fish. So we see here that now this saying is just purely a wisdom teaching about that one thing necessary, about letting go of all the distractions and uniting our heart and our will on that one thing that is truly worthy of our lives, of our attention. So it seems pretty obvious when we see this version, that the version in Thomas, which is simpler, more primitive, that it seems to be the earlier version, and that Matthew has added the apocalyptic into the saying. So there are lots of sayings where this same process we see at work. It's a wisdom saying in Thomas, and it becomes an apocalyptic saying in Matthew or in one of the other Gospels. So this has led some scholars to say that the canonical material represents eschatological teaching, end times teaching, and Thomas is not an eschatological gospel. It's not focused on eschatology. It's a protological gospel. It's focused on the beginning. And we see this in one of the sayings where Jesus is asked by the disciples to tell them how their end will come. They say, Jesus, how will the end come? What will the end of the world be like? And he responds, have you discovered the beginning? That you seek to know the end? First find the beginning, and you will know the end. For where the beginning is, there the end will be. A beautiful sort of alpha and omega kind of take on things, that he says, if you find the true beginning in God, you know where the true end is. And he sort of rejects running off into the apocalyptic scenarios. He's like, we're not going to worry about what's going to happen at the end of time. Let's find the beginning, and then we'll know the end. So the question this gives us, the question for historical Jesus scholars, is what direction was the historical Jesus himself teaching in? And this has plagued historical Jesus scholarship now for decades, ever since the project began. And was Jesus an apocalyptic prophet of the end times or not? And most mainstream Jesus scholarship for several decades has really made the argument that Jesus was a failed apocalyptic prophet, that he expected the end to come in his life and he got it wrong. This was the position that was taken by Albert Schweitzer. If you know Albert Schweitzer's work, faithful disciple of Jesus, but he argued that Jesus did have an apocalyptic worldview and kind of got that point wrong, and we can, follow the rest of his teachings. And this was what was taught in seminaries in higher biblical criticism for decades. So, young pastor-to-be goes off to seminary and learns that, Jesus got it wrong, and then these new pastors have to go and somehow break it to their congregations, break the news. And all of that scholarship changed when Thomas came on the scene, because it said to us, wait, maybe the apocalyptic doesn't go back to Jesus. Maybe this is an overlay from the early church. And maybe Jesus' teachings were totally wisdom-centered. And the truth is, we can't know. We can't know which is the case, but we can make a really strong argument that if the baseline material across the gospel tradition is wisdom material, and if the material that shows up as apocalyptic was flexible enough to be interpreted non-apocalyptically by Thomas and apocalyptically by Matthew, and the non-apocalyptic versions seem to be more primitive, more earlier accounts, that this is likely closer to the original teaching of Jesus. So we're then left with the question, why would the early church have added this apocalyptic material on? And this goes back to what we were talking about yesterday. Contemporary scholarship pretty much universally says that the four Gospels, the narrative Gospels, were written after the year 70. Matthew, Mark, and John, written after 70. 70 was an apocalyptic moment in the life of the early church and of first century Judaism. In the year 70, the Jewish temple, the second temple, was destroyed by Rome. There had been an ongoing Roman-Jewish war, and the temple was razed to the ground. So Judaism had to totally reorient itself, and Christianity is being born within this moment. And so this is also the moment when persecution begins picking up in the early church. Christians are being pushed out of the synagogues. Rome begins cracking down on these Jesus followers. And the Gospels came of age within this milieu, a moment that felt incredibly apocalyptic. And as the gospel narratives were constructed, they were constructed in light of that experience. And we see that some of the sayings of Jesus that would otherwise be seen as a wisdom saying began taking on a martyrological tone, a sort of martyrdom tone. So an example, Jesus said, "You must lose your life in order to find life." Most scholars agree that's the earliest version of that saying. And on its own, it sounds like a wisdom saying. You must lose your life, lose your small egoic self and your tight-fisted hold on things in order to find life. But it becomes, in the later tradition, whoever loses their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save their life or will find life. And so now it's a saying about martyrdom, which makes sense because the gospel needs to speak in every time and context, and these people are living through this reality. But our texts were shaped by that experience. And this is where Thomas is really helpful, because most scholars believe Thomas was written in Syria, in a town called Edessa, which would be in modern-day Turkey. And what's really fascinating about this is that Edessa at that time fell outside of the Roman Empire. And Thomas' preaching mission has long been associated with Syria and specifically with Edessa and also with India. We have lots of early legends about Thomas' preaching mission going through Syria and down into India. And I've even been to the supposed site of Thomas' martyrdom in southern India in Chennai. So this is very much tracking with what tradition has said. And for Jesus followers who were living in Edessa, they were in a buffer zone between the Roman and the Persian empires, sort of like, the neutral zone between the Klingons and the Federation or whatever. It's this buffer zone that was relatively peaceful. And so the tradition developed there outside of the context of apocalyptic and persecution in which the canonical material was developing. And so this strand of the early tradition was allowed to develop purely along a wisdom trajectory. So Thomas gives us a window into one strand of early Christian development that's very different from what we're most familiar with. And we could call it a champion of a non-dual expression of the Jesus teaching. And I imagine it was likelier to maintain a non-dual understanding when you weren't living through persecution and martyrdom. So that's a little of the background. And before we dive in, I want to now just start looking at the material, at the teaching. But before we do that, there's the question of the date of this text, when was it written, and the question of why wasn't it preserved. So scholars tend to think that it's better for us to not think of a single Thomas text, but rather a rolling Thomas, a developing text. What we possess is a 4th century Coptic translation of an earlier text. And we can see some development from the Greek fragments that we have to the Coptic translation. There's, some little differences in development within the textual tradition. And so when we talk about dating Thomas, when was it written? Well, which Thomas are we trying to date? Are we trying to date the 4th century translation? Are we trying to date the Greek fragments? Are we trying to date the earliest theoretical version of the text? So you see how it gets messy. But there's a growing consensus among a lot of mainstream scholars that the core of the Thomas sayings collection is early 1st century. There's a core of sayings that goes back to possibly mid-1st century, and that the fully developed text, Elaine Pagels, she dates it to the late 1st century, around the time that the Gospel of John was being completed. So we think John was probably completed around 90 or 100. So she argues that the core of the text goes back maybe even before the canonical Gospels, you know, to around the year 50 or something, and that we get a finalized version towards the end of the first century. There is a scholarly camp that wants to push the whole text into the second century and say that it's a late development, because I think personally the attraction there is that you can then write the text off. You don't have to deal with it if it's a late second century text. But it seems pretty conclusive to me that it's preserving very early primitive sayings, and that we definitely have something that goes back to the first century here. So that's the dating of the text. And then the question of why was the text lost? And the quick, easy answer would be to say, because it was heretical. That's why we lost the text. And it's important here to make a distinction between two words, or one word, and that's the word gnosis and the word Gnosticism. So the word gnosis, it's just a Greek word that is a perfectly Orthodox New Testament word. It shows up in the writings of Paul. Whenever Paul talks about the knowledge of Christ, the Greek word is gnosis. So gnosis points to that inner, intimate spiritual knowing. And it's part of every expression of mysticism, that inner knowledge. Now, in the 2nd through 4th centuries, a movement developed in the church that scholars now retroactively call capital G Gnosticism. And Gnosticism wasn't a uniform movement. It was lots of different movements within the early church that kind of get lumped together. But there's a mythos that's shared by some of those elements. And the early church very rightly sort of wrote this off as unorthodox. So the teaching was that, first of all, this world that we live in is a total mistake. God did not create it. God did not desire it. It's a total error, and we should not be here. Which ties into part of our human experience. Why is there suffering? Why is there so much evil in the world? And so they said, because it's a mistake. And so their mythology said that in the beginning, out of the eternal silence, the eternal void of the Father, there arose archons, or sort of like demigods, these original deities. And one of them was Logos, or Logos, the Word. One of them was Sophia, Holy Wisdom. And they arose in pairs as consorts. And so Logos, the Word that becomes incarnate in Jesus, and Holy Wisdom were a pair. And Sophia, Holy Wisdom, being the bad girl that she was, she tried to create or reproduce without the aid of her consort. And what came into being was this blind god called Yaldabaoth. And this blind god, in the process, the material world matter. And this false god then says, well, I'm the only one here, I must be God, and says, everyone worship me, everyone follow my laws and my rules. And the tradition said this was the God of the Hebrew Bible. The God of the scriptures was this false God, and Jesus then incarnates from the true eternal realm to tell us it's all a big mistake. You don't belong here, and to give us the secret knowledge that will liberate us from our captivity in matter, with a capital G. And the early church said, no, this is heresy. All the worlds, seen and unseen, both fundamentally good, not a mistake. It's declared heresy. When these Nag Hammadi scriptures came forward, some of the scriptures that were in the collection clearly reflected this Gnostic myth that the church had rejected. But in the process, scholars just said, well, all of it is capital G Gnostic, and it all got lumped under that heading. and sort of written off as late 2nd to 4th century Gnosticism. As the scholarship developed over the decades, scholars started saying, wait, a lot of these texts are clearly not capital G Gnostic. A lot of these texts seem to be representing a different viewpoint. And the Gospel of Thomas to that. The Gospel of Thomas has no markers of the Gnostic myth. Instead, Thomas seems to Can you hear me? All right. Good. I've just totally glitched out there. And all right. Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me, those of you who I can see. Okay, all right. I think we're back, and looks like our participants are still here, and I'm going to, it looks like we're So I was just explaining this context of Gnosticism, and that we really should not see the Gospel of Thomas as a capital G Gnostic text, that it doesn't bear the markers of Gnostic mythology or cosmology text. And so we can call it Gnostic with a little g, that it is a text about mystical gnosis or inner knowing, but we should not call it Gnostic with a capital G. It's not a part of that wider movement. And I've even heard an Eastern Orthodox monk who encountered the Gospel of Thomas when it was first translated and read it, and with a sort of shock of surprise, a shock of recognition, said, why, this is just Eastern Orthodox mysticism. He said that the teachings in Thomas are entirely congruent with the wider Eastern Orthodox mystical tradition. So I don't think we can argue that we lost Thomas principally because it's heretical. There has to be another reason. And is simply its contemplative inner mystical focus, that focus has never appealed to a majority of human beings. Not everyone wants to do the inner work. Not everyone is called to do the inner work. That's probably why this was preserved by monks at a Bohemian monastery. They were really drawn to these inner teachings. The other reason that I think it was lost is simply because the sayings genre fell out of fashion. In the early years of the church, sayings gospels were how it was done. You collected the sayings of Jesus because that was what was most important to preserve. And then as the early apostles began dying off, they realized it's time to record the story. We need to get the story down. And so all those early sayings gospels were collected and compiled into the now predominant, prevailing canonical narrative gospels. And so sayings gospels just fell by the wayside because they were no longer the preferred gospel model. So those are the reasons I think Thomas essentially fell away. Its inner focus didn't have mass appeal. Sayings gospels fell out of favor. And now, though, we're at a point where it's back. The Gospel of Thomas has returned. And maybe it's back when we need it the most, because I always find it an interesting coincidence, if not synchronicity, that Thomas resurfaced in 1945, which was the same year we dropped the atomic bomb over Hiroshima. That at this incredibly fragmented moment within human existence, these powerfully unitive teachings emerged from the sands of Egypt. So what Thomas gives us is that missing how piece. We talked yesterday about my friend who said she's a Buddhist Christian because because Jesus tells her to love her neighbor and the Buddha tells her how. Well, Thomas is really about how. How do you live this unitive vision? And what we'll start doing this afternoon, we'll really begin digging into those teachings and unpacking what Thomas is about and the vision that it gives us, which again, I don't think is in any way in competition with what the canonical gospels give us. I think it's really complementary to them. But we'll just start opening the circle up now for some sharings and reflections, because I give you all permission to unmute yourselves, and we'll put things into our group context. So if you have a question about the material that's just been presented, feel free to ask that. Or if you have a reflection or sharing, and this could also go back to our heart practice work yesterday. So let's first, before we even share, just take one more deep breath together. Heady kind of information. We don't want to lose connection to our hearts. And then from that heart space, we'll open the circle and see what's alive for you all. So feel free to share if you are moved to. And I'll add, there's a part of me that's sort of sad to spend a session on this historical context because the teachings of the text are so rich. But I find there's such a barrier around this text that unless we do that historical work, it can be hard for folks sometimes to access what the text is offering. So what's stirring for you as you begin hearing this context and back?
Well, could I say something about yesterday first? Can you hear me?
Yeah, please. Yeah, Marilyn, we hear you.
Okay, thank you. What you talked about yesterday, the work that you did stayed on my mind all the evening, all night long, and I would hope to come across refresher sessions in it, because I had tried to grasp that. I've read Sardello, I've read Cynthia Bourgeault, and it's a lot of reading. It's a lot to wrap your mind around just as text. But somehow the verbal communication that you did so well, I was able to get more into it last evening and this morning. And I feel like that, it's a matter of having different perspectives on it, how to do it, different examples. And so I would so much appreciate if it comes back around again, I don't know, in subsequent teachings that you might offer, or short sessions or something. Because I just feel it's so right and so true, and what I've been searching for my entire life in all my studies. It rings the most true of anything, and so I want to participate in it even more deeply.
Thank you, Marilyn. That's beautiful and powerfully said. Yes, I think when we discover our heart, we discover our home, our true home that's been with us all along. And I had done a retreat on specifically this heart work. It was called The Way of the Heart. And so the whole retreat was just on working with the heart. And so maybe I can do that online sometime. But I think the real important thing is just to keep exploring it in your own practice. Just keep coming back to it, exploring and the tenderness of the heart. Just keep putting your awareness there, and in different contexts at different times, and just get acquainted with it, because it's part of us that we don't necessarily know very well, because our culture and unfortunately our spiritual traditions haven't introduced us to our own hearts.
And I will do that. And I did take some time last evening to talk to my Sufi teacher, who is a disciple of a Murshid, a master, that I have some contact, because so much of it is in common with the teaching of the Sufi, I'm finding, seeing with the eye of the heart, the imaginal seeing. And so that deepens my understanding too. So thank you.
Yeah. Yes, Marilyn, the closest tradition to prayer of the heart spirituality is
Maybe if we all stop our videos, he'll come back.
Hi, can everybody please turn off their videos? We've all been trying, it seems to take up the band space, and then we lose Matthew. Thank you so much.
Friends,
Hi, welcome back.
Hi.
I just moved into another room. I have no idea what's going on with this. I've never had such internet problems, but now you see the kitchen behind me. So we're back, or at least some of us are. It looks like we've lost some folks along the way, but maybe this will give me a better signal. So let's just continue where we were. And okay, yeah, Mark's giving thumbs up. Yeah, any other reflections? Mark, I'm curious, you as a bishop of the church, what you think about the Gospel of Thomas.
Well, I don't want to get into that from that perspective, but I think you're right. I think you're right about the parts that the church, the rationale for early on for the covering up, and I think that scholarship has moved beyond that. Understands those reasons and move beyond them. But I think it's still curious how pervasive that kind of thinking is. I mean, even when I mentioned this retreat to a couple priest friends of mine, are like, oh, Gospel of Thomas, like, okay, whatever. So it is pervasive, and I think they're, especially among the clergy who want to be, as you mentioned earlier on, they learn at seminary and stuff, and so I think that capital G thing does pervade in Gnosticism, and so therefore people say, well, I don't want to be caught trafficking in that business, where it's just and that's just a structural thing where they haven't freed themselves from the structure enough to be able to say, hey, I can, and I think you're right to say these are complementary and not in, and that we're just really scared about stuff that's not maybe in the Bible or something, which we don't treat any other theology like that, right? Like we read all sorts of theology. We read Rowan Williams and say, oh, that's helped me go deeper, but we can't read Thomas and go deeper. So yeah, I think it's wonderful. I like all these texts.
Thank you.
If you tell anybody I said that, I'll deny it.
Okay.
I'm just kidding. I'll say what I want.
Thank you so much. And I wanted to report after yesterday's class that due to the work that we did with centering in the heart, I was feeling like a wonderful energy with me the whole remainder of the day. And it was, it's like, I don't know the word for it, spiritual energy. I don't know, but it was very beautiful and real. And more energy, like not tired, like a good energy. And I did want to share one thing. We were talking about the various practices that maybe we don't know exactly what Jesus's practices were when he was alive, but I thought of a practice that's it's still practiced in the Jewish faith, which is called, I don't know if you know of it, it's called laying of Tefillin. Have you heard of it?
Yes, but explain for us all.
Okay. People might not know what it is, but it can be very lovely. And I saw my grandfather do it every morning. So it's in the Bible, it's biblically mandated for men. And it's taking words from the Bible and it's putting them in a little small leather box. Literally, it's a physical practice and a spiritual one. And it's a little small box that you put on your hand and you wrap leather straps around. And the men also do it in the middle of the forehead, which, not to get too esoteric, but it's the third eye spot. And then there's a concentration exercise and a praying exercise. And I don't know much about the practice other than having seen it done, but from what I read just a little bit yesterday, it's supposed to do the coming together of the body, the heart, as we were doing, and of the hands. So I thought that was a very lovely prayer to contemplate. So I wanted to, people can look it up. It's very interesting.
Thank you.
There's also a box that's near the heart on the bicep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you.
Yep.
Matthew?
Yes.
It's Virginia.
Hey, Virginia, jump in.
I wonder if you could do a quick recapitulation of the Holy Sophia and the male aspect, because you kind of cut out at that moment, and that was really interesting to me. And I got confused about that.
I think maybe what you're referencing, and we'll talk more about the Sophia connection later, but I think you're talking about when I was sharing that Gnostic mythology, and their idea was that these original, sort of almost like demigods emerge from, the eternal Father. And one of the pairings, one of the consort pairings was Logos. In the beginning was the Word, and Sophia, or Chokmah, Holy Wisdom in the Scriptures. So that's part of that mythology. I don't know if that,
That's exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah, so it was interesting because there was like an intimation that the male energy was actually evil, encountering the female energy, right? Because you were talking about the dark energy, that the male component of that had darkness around him, and that was the reason there was so much evil in the world, right?
I mean, all of these old mythologies, of course, you can see they're working with archetypes and energies, and so yes, it's dealing with the union of those, animus and anima, yin and yang, and that when they're out of balance, what happens? That's what it's dealing with. But the mythology ultimately gave birth to a world-denying spirituality, that the world was a mistake. But there's definitely something at the core of it about balance and integration that is continued in the Gospel of Thomas. And we'll look at that in the teachings this afternoon, because it really talks about the way we need to integrate within ourselves, masculine, feminine, male, female, etc. But it does it outside of that world-denying context.
Because for me, it really spoke strongly about the male energy wanting to control and punish the female energy.
Well, it's in that myth, it's the child that is born is the blind God. And then Logos, which represents, the other half of the consort, is what incarnates in Jesus to kind of restore things back. But if you feel inclined to read those mythologies, and you can go to something like the Nag Hammadi library, all of the scriptures that were found at Nag Hammadi are now bound in one volume. You could explore those myths and sort of ask the questions of, well, how do these archetypes relate to my own experience? And when I do something that's out of balance, what is the blindness that I give birth to? All of that can be internalized.
Okay.
Patricia. Oh, we don't hear you, Patricia. It shows that you're unmuted, but I don't hear your voice. No, does anyone else hear her?
No.
No, we don't hear any audio coming through from your computer, so you might need to type in your comment if you want, and I will read it out to everyone. The word mystic. Can you give your definition of it, especially how it's used for today's people? What is the definition of the word mystic? Evelyn Underhill, sort of great Anglican mystic, she said that mysticism is the art or the practice of union with reality. For me, on a practical level, it really is about all of the language of union with God, etc., can become so abstract. But on a practical level, St. Paul says, as we're deepening in union, how do we know that? By the fruits of the Spirit that are present in our lives. So as we move into deeper union with God, we're becoming, on the practical relational level, more loving, more compassionate, more open, more connected beings. And with what? With reality, with God. And so for me, it's all of our contemplative practices are about how we become more grounded, centered, and loving beings in the world. So in that sense, everyone is or can be a mystic. Everyone can grow in love. Everyone can grow in inner stillness. Everyone can grow in equanimity. Everyone can grow in the fire for justice in our world. So in a really simple, practical way, that's what it's about for me. How do we awaken to our oneness? And of course, we experience oneness as love, but oneness spills over in action that looks like justice. So it's ultimately, how do we become transformed human beings? How do we become, and this is what these Gospels will lead us into, especially when we get to the Gospel of Mary. It's all about how do we become fully human beings? And Mary references Jesus as a fully human being who has prepared us so that we might become fully human ones as well. So the mystic is someone who is striving to become fully human. And that, of course, implies that most of us, most of the time, are subhuman. Any other voices before we take our afternoon break?
Matthew?
Yeah, Mike.
Hey, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. So the thing that really strikes me more and more with contemplative spirituality, contemplative Christian spirituality, is the importance of experience, right? We experience these things, just like we had the experience with the heart meditation and putting our attention into the heart. More and more, for me at least, Christianity is about presence, is about experience. And I think the way to consume the Gospels in this Lectio Divina style that some of us are accustomed to is to really experience the words as they come in. That open heart, that open-heartedness, that being as if entraining your heart to the text, maybe is another way to express that, and seeing where that wisdom arises from. In the experience of that. So all of this stuff, I think, to me, that's how I'm taking in all of what you're sharing here, is being with it from a deeper place, not trying to understand it so much,
right,
but simply being with what you're saying from that deeper place.
Thank you, Mike. And that's another good definition of what mysticism is. It's about moving into experience. What is our direct experience of God, of life, of spirituality, of our humanness? And so again, someone said, well, then why are there so few mystics? And or why is mysticism supposedly only for a few? And I would say it's ultimately for all of us. Everyone doesn't awaken to that impulse necessarily, but in some sense, every impulse towards deeper and fuller humanness is the mystic impulse. We might not always, cloak it in religious trappings and language, but that it's ultimately the drive towards experience. And I think that's what someone like Panikkar or a text like Thomas does. It redirects us that this isn't primarily about beliefs in our head, ideas in our head. It's about our direct experience. And we can reframe all of our great dogmas and doctrines as invitations to experience. The incarnation can be a belief. Well, do you believe that it happened? Or it can be, as Barbara Brown Taylor said, a practice. How do I practice incarnating God in my life? And then it's not an idea and I believe in the incarnation. It's I practice incarnation. I experience incarnation. We can do the same with the Trinity. The Trinity is a weird thing you believe, or we experience that exchange and dance of divine love and relationship that gives birth to the worlds. So I think the mystical invitation is to move from abstract idea to direct experience, encounter,
I'd just like to add one more thing.
Yeah, please.
From Thomas Merton. I do a lot of work with Merton, and his assumption, right? The basis for him wanting to reintroduce contemplative practice was that we're all contemplatives. We're all originally contemplatives. We lost it along the way.
Mm-hmm.
And the invitation is for all of us in our own way to regain that original state, because it's in that state that we're truly in communion with our source, with God.
Yeah, beautifully said. The Gospel of Thomas, we'll see there are some sayings that really look at that it's about returning to the original state that we were in when we were born, in some sense. There's some things that point directly to that kind of teaching.
Matthew, there was something you were saying when I tuned in this morning about, it was a quotation from the Gospel of Thomas about pouring out and pouring into us.
Yeah.
Can you repeat that? Because I wanted to, there's been too much I've been trying to keep up with in typing and I didn't catch
Sure.
it.
Yeah, it's saying, it might be saying 108 if I remember. It's Jesus said, "Whoever drinks from my mouth will become like me. I myself will become that person, and the hidden things will be revealed." So it's this drinking from the mouth of Jesus in such a way that we become Christ. So yes, that's the saying. I could try to find specific. I'm going to send out a sheet. I'll have it for our next session and link it to you all. That'll have some of these sayings. I don't know that I have it here anymore. But yes. Whoever drinks from my mouth, or I think one of the definitions says, whoever drinks what flows, one of the translations, whoever drinks what flows from my mouth will become as I am. I myself will become that one.
It is 108.
108, thanks, Mark.
Matthew?
Yes, Mark, other
Hi,
Mark.
Matthew. This is probably just an exercise in the imagination, but you mentioned how Thomas ended up in India. And I'm wondering if there's been any scholarship on how Patanjali's Yoga Sutras and Thomas's work kind of line up, or any connections there. I mean, if you look at the essence of the sutras and the essence of the Gospel of Thomas, there's this practices that are all leading towards union and equanimity and stillness, and so I just see a lot of, the essence of both of them, similar. And I mean, I know Thomas was written in Syria, you said, many years after Patanjali would have been around, but I was just wondering if there's anybody has ever looked at those connections.
There are some books and some commentaries on Thomas in light of Eastern and Indian mysticism. So there's some of that out there. And I do find it interesting that Thomas is the apostle to India, and the Gospel of Thomas is so congruent with Vedic, Upanishadic sort of unitive mysticism. There's a wonderful text that's clearly sort of later legendary stories, but the Acts of Thomas. And this was a genre in the early church, 2nd, 3rd century. There was a whole wealth of acts written. So the Acts of John, the Acts of Paul and Thecla, the Acts of Thomas. And it's the sort of, fantastical accounts of the stories of the apostles' missionary journeys and preaching. But the Acts of Thomas is all about Thomas's journey into India and his preaching there.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some wonderful prayers attributed to Thomas that are recorded in that text, including Eucharistic prayers that use divine feminine language. Maybe I'll bring some of those and read them just for fun. But he invokes the hidden mother and refers to the Holy Spirit and the feminine during the epiclesis. And is there direct relationship or influence between those texts? Who knows? But obviously we're dealing with universal mystical insights. And so he doesn't have to have ever encountered that wisdom for that wisdom, a similar wisdom, to show up in this text. But that said, these lands are part of the Silk Road. Like, wisdom from traditions was flowing at the time of Jesus very actively. So there's no reason to think that there wasn't cross-pollination and influence happening. And at the same time, I don't think you need to send Jesus or Thomas to India to get this kind of wisdom, because this deepest mystical wisdom is already present within the Jewish tradition. I think sometimes there's almost a subtle anti-Semitism in saying Jesus must have gone to India to learn this wisdom, because it implies that he couldn't have found it within Judaism, you know? But I think there's certainly a possibility of some cross-pollination happening. And if you Google online, you can find some books that do compare Thomas and the wisdom of India.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Well, we're at 11:30, so we should wind down. We'll come back at 2 and we'll start digging into the actual teachings of the text. But let's just close with another simple chant and reconnecting with our hearts. So let's use that saying 108 to make a simple chant. This is one of the wonderful things about Thomas, is that the sayings are so short and pithy and concentrated, you can turn almost any one of them into a chant. You can just start it on a monotone and see what happens. And so I invite you to join your voices to this line from Thomas. Whoever drinks from my mouth will become like me. Whoever drinks from my mouth will become like me. Whoever drinks from my mouth will become like me. Whoever drinks from my mouth will become like me. Whoever drinks from my mouth will become like me. Whoever drinks from my mouth will become like me. Whoever drinks from my mouth will become like me. Whoever drinks from my mouth will become like me. So take a moment in the silence to drink from the mouth of Jesus, the living wisdom that is still flowing. Grounding down into the heart and carrying that heart-centeredness with you into the afternoon. Amen. So I invite you just to keep this heart grounding with you as you go about your day, as you have your lunch, and we'll gather back here at 2, and I'll try yet again for a better internet connection. This seems to be working, and we'll see each other then, God willing. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.